Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 11 in our introduction to big data analytics. A lot going on, going very quickly this term. So we'll go ahead and kind of jump right into the material. So we'll start off, as always, with a discussion of the assignments. Then we'll move on to the reading, and then we'll talk a little bit about a special topic. In this case, it's around ethics and big data. So something that might be relevant. It's always a good idea to consider big data from an ethics perspective. So um, what does it mean when we say that, and what are the implications? So jumping straight into the assignments and making sure I'm sharing the right thing. There we go. Sharing the wrong screen. Kind of off my game today. So moving back to the course outline, where are we? Well, we're kind of getting near the end. We're into Unit 5, which is centers on the application of big data analytics, and in particular, we're down in here. Today is the 16th, so the next big thing that's coming up is your Unit 5 individual project, which is worth 200 points. So kind of you're almost there, but also this is a good time to make sure that you finish strong. So most of you have been doing well. I think everybody is pretty much caught up. Um, a few pointers that we'll want to go over with the assignment. The analytics that I've seen, and especially on the Unit 4 individual project from some was a little lacking. This basically showing a graph is not really analytics, and there are numerous instances of that sort of level of specificity, so or precision and depth. Spend a little bit of time doing some sort of work beyond just visualization or even just dumping things out. So I understand that it may be a challenge for some of you, but do your best, but try to make it a little more advanced than just visualization or descriptive descriptions of the text or of the data. So into Unit 5, it is about the application of big data. In particular, some of the things we've talked about a little bit in the past is, well, what's the advantages of having a doctorate degree in big data? The short answer is it's instant credibility, especially if that's your field that you're working in. So having a degree that's both a degree in computer science and also a degree in big data analytics or focusing on big data analytics is very valuable. There's also some ethical considerations, and that's part of what we'll talk about today. And yeah, plenty of jobs in big data analytics. And if you're looking for a job, let me know. But moving on to the Unit 5 individual project. So the outline is given to you that you should follow. Feel free to make it a little better. This is one of those things that I will probably try to adapt, assuming that I get the go ahead to do the cleanup of this course, because there's several things that are kind of missing and focus is a little off. So going through what it says to do, you need to go out and find yourself a data set with at least 500,000 records. That's the first thing. Should be relatively straightforward to do. There's lots of that kind of data around. So you need to find something with uh, at least 500,000 records. And then basically make sure you tell me where that's coming from, right? Don't just get a mystery data set. You need to be able to use it and cite it according to APA, right? So there's a way that you cite data sets. Try to do it. Um, and it needs there's plenty of free ones out there. Certainly don't buy anything. And the idea here is that you should have, as with all papers, an introduction. You should set the scope as to what it is you're to talk about. As a reminder, APA does not have an introduction section. Instead, the first thing after the title on the first page of content is assumed to be the introduction. So don't put introduction heading in there. It's not appropriate. The scope is basically just saying what is the data that you're doing, what is the realm that you're doing. And it is a little weird the way that it's described here as a metadata report. What that is saying is you're saying what you're going to say about the data. Uh, so so analyze and process the data into meaningful information, and then you're going to take that information and present it in some sort of a summarization, recommendation, or whatever. So basically, you're going to, the scope is going to say, what is the data that I'm talking about? Where did it come from? What is its purpose? What is its background, perhaps, and so on. The purpose, why should an organization care about that data? Or why should anyone care? Maybe it's the organization, maybe it's something more generic. If for some reason you were analyzing a data set that had a bunch of records around heart defects or something, or anomalies in EKGs, the obviously the benefit might be that earlier diagnosis of heart conditions or something, and that could decrease mortality rate and so on. The supporting factors or forces and challenging forces. This is a generic kind of concept of there are things that make things happen and things that fight against things. So try to do your best with this. It may or may not be very applicable depending upon what your data set is, but to do try to approach it, and also approach it from the perspective of an applications perspective. So you're going to go through, you're going to do some analysis of some data. You're going to come up with you're going to use a method to do that analysis using some tool, R, Hadoop, Python, whatever it might be. Then you're going to use some models, which is nothing more than a statistical representation of a thing. And it may be that you could even go so far as to say it's kind of an approach to analytics. So maybe it's clustering, regression, and so on. And then you're going to go through and come up with some sort of results and how that result would actually be utilized. That's kind of the intent. And that's where this is a little bit off, because the analytical plan would be more of a plan for application, not so much a plan for analytics. And the anticipated results would be kind of the benefit of the organization for applying the application of your results to the organization, which means you also previously had to share those results. So that's kind of not necessarily really spelled out here. So that's what I'm saying. There's a few gaps in the outline, but do your best, and feel free to flesh out something that you think is missing. Try not to omit too many things unless it's perhaps abbreviated forms of the supporting and challenging forces, because that's a little, those may be hard to make fit inside of your paper. Unit resources available in your course room. Some of them might be pretty useful. At this point, the big data boom is probably a little dated, but the short answer is, yeah, there's lots of jobs. Moving on to the reading, this week you should have read, or for chapter or week 11, you should be reading basically a couple, I believe those are papers. So the idea is just applications, and you may want to read something actually a little newer than that. So moving on to our special topic, which is around ethics and big data. So some of this stuff you have to kind of define a little bit ahead of time. What is ethics? We kind of know what big data is. We'll start off with saying, first of all, big data is unto itself neither ethical or unethical. It is data. It's not good, it's not bad. It's a mechanism or a tool that can be used to accomplish something, but it does have some pretty significant relation to things like privacy, reputation, ownership, and identity. We take the things that can be accomplished with big data are significant and concerning because they can actually significantly impact our world. People can figure out who you are by what you do, and correlate things and get a very precise model of you. And in fact, the digital twin applied to people is not an unusual concept. It's been applied and considered in multiple places, including marketing, employee retention, all kinds of spaces. So the idea of basically creating a model that represents a person, and based upon the inputs that are gathered and combined together using big data technologies, kind of scary, kind of useful, yeah. So, but it does require this concept of ongoing and consistent alignment between actions and values. So you need to make certain that if your organization has a particular set of values associated with what you're supposed to be doing, that you haven't somehow slipped and started doing something that you should not. Big data does require ethical decision making ahead of time. You need to make sure that you know what you're doing as you do it, because it may have some serious implications to yourself legally as well as reputation-wise. An organization that is considered intrusive goes from being something that's considered a good thing to a bad thing very quickly. Google had some challenges with its relationship with some of its somewhat questionable sort of activities around Wi-Fi snooping. Whenever they were doing their Google Maps, they would also look for Wi-Fi networks that were open, doing nothing that is, they're not hacking or anything like that, but they were gathering information that could then be used to potentially identify people and when they went home and a few other things by considering the MAC address if it were to be broadcast of the Wi-Fi network or some identifier. And then if somebody connects to it with an Android device that maybe they have access to, then maybe they know where you are very precisely. Kind of concerning, especially if you didn't consent to that. So you can get a black eye, so to speak, on a company's reputation very quickly by a misstep related to ethical considerations with big data. You can go from being, you know, a proponent and a champion in the industry to being big brother really quickly. So something to be considered about. So there's lots of ethical issues related to big data. There's an entire discussion that could be had around ethics in general in computers, big data, and across lots of domains. I actually teach a course or have taught a course that relates to ethics across the computing industry. And one of the topics we did talk about is big data. Also, artificial intelligence kind of fits in here too, because there's some definitely ethical considerations around that. So, but whenever you start, there's an entire discussion that you can have around what is ethics, what type of ethics, does the ends justify the means, all those kind of arguments. But it's generally speaking a conflict between a public good and the private good. The public good being what's good for the entire society, and the private good being what's good for an individual within that society. And that also speaks to things like privacy versus and confidentiality in conflict with things potentially as far as like transparency and so on. You also have issues around equity of access, making sure that people can get to the same amounts of information, and a very much of an informed use of information. A lot of this stuff has been addressed with things like GDPR and so on, where you have to actually give an explicit agreement for things like cookie tracking and a few other things. But you really, if you're going to give somebody your data, it's really important you know what they're going to do with it, and more importantly, if there's any kind of secondary uses of that data beyond what its primary use was, that's very clear and something that's agreed upon, not necessarily something that's just done. In the past, that's what we would do. We would gather lots of data and then we would kind of use it in a way other than what it was originally intended. That recycling and reuse of data was considered kind of the gold standard for a while in big data, because you know you've got free data, right? You don't have to gather it independently. You've already got it. You're kind of mining the stuff you've already got and gaining new insights from it. The problem with that approach, though, is if that data relates to people and they did not consent for you to use the data in that way, you have violated their trust. And also potentially several laws these days. So moving on to the concepts of terminologies, and it's important to speak with concise terminology. While we can, the semantics may be kind of considered minutiae at times of way you're just saying a different word, you kind of need to understand it. Whenever you talk about rights and interest, the concept of a right is itself ethical. Um, you have a right as an individual for certain set of things, as well as our concept of legalities of rights that are and given to you by our Constitution and various other laws. So there's also interests, uh, which is kind of somewhat related, but um, it's kind of a question of who has an interest related to a certain piece of data, not necessarily who has certainly a right to that data or what rights are associated with your use of that data. Personal data is typically referring to a person, a individual, and typically we talk about things like PII, so personally identifiable information. This is data that identifies that individual in such a way that you could select them from a crowd, and it's things like name, social, maybe address, phone number. There's lots of PII. And generally speaking, that's governed with a higher degree of sensitivity and concern than things that aren't necessarily PII. There's also this concept of the responsible organization, and that's the organization that's concerned with handling of the data and making sure they're doing so in accordance with how they should be handling it. Um, and it's also related to if they're doing that or if it looks like they're doing that. Sometimes perception can be as bad as reality. So if you and maybe worse, if you're perceived as an organization who mishandles data, maybe lets it out when it shouldn't be, even if you don't necessarily do it, maybe it happened one time on a subset of data that wasn't even real, but the world decided that you don't do it appropriately and correctly, that becomes a problem. A responsible organization is an organization that does so in a way that is considered. And there's also going to be a responsible organization as in who's at fault. Those are going to be kind of overloaded terms meaning similar things. There's this concept of a data supply chain. And what it kind of comes down to is this idea that you may not necessarily capture all the data yourself, but rather you may purchase it. The problem you have with acquiring data from somebody else is that not everybody is to the same level of ethical concern as you might be as an organization or even as an individual. So if you buy data or integrate with somebody that gives you bad data or misuses the data you were to give them, and that's another aspect of it. There's a whole data ecosystem where you buy and sell data, and then sometimes organizations their data is more valuable than any of their other assets. So it's important to be very cautious of who it is that you're integrating with, who you're sharing your data with, who you're receiving data from, because you've got this upstream and downstream. And so if anywhere along your supply line you've got a problem, maybe you're getting data from an irreputable source, or maybe you're giving it to someone who's using it in an irreputable or inappropriate way, you can end up with some really bad things. And you can't go with the concept of everybody does it, because there was a time that was kind of the argument. Well, everybody tracks cookies on your web browser, so it's okay. And it turns out, no, it's not okay. People like the ability to choose what you have stored about them. And it also comes to the question of who owns that data. And the latest trends are more towards an individual that generated that data on the data, not the organization that captured it. So I own my data with regards to something like Google or Facebook or any social media platform, versus there was a time that it was the companies felt that they owned your data, and you really couldn't even know what they know about you, let alone say, I want you to delete everything there is about me, which you can do today. As an example, here's Mozilla's data privacy principles. And these are pretty good ideas and pretty good concepts, and also kind of give you an example of a privacy principle sort of policy that a lot of organizations have. Almost every organization that is a reputable organization anyway has a documented approach towards their handling of your data, and they share it. And typically it is things similar to this, where like Mozilla's no surprises, the user should be aware that you're using the data in a transparent and beneficial way. That's a reasonable sort of thing. So they're not doing something with it that's unexpected. The same thing with the user control, that put the user in control of their data and online experience, a reasonable sort of expectation. Collect only what you need, and if possible, de-identify the data as well as much as you can, and then get rid of it when you don't need it any longer. The trouble you have with de-identification is sometimes it can be undone. That's what the netbook or the Netflix, I think it was Grand Challenge is what they called it, where they were essentially looking for an improvement on the recommendation engine. They shared a bunch of de-identified data that had been cleansed, sanitized, so that it should have been difficult to piece together who was who. People figured out how to do it and actually identified a few people. And so not a good thing. So you have to be very careful whenever you start considering the power of big data is its fact of looking at data from multiple dimensions and mapping it back together. That's the whole point. So it's kind of concerning that you ever kind of rely on that. It certainly should be done, but don't assume that it's your only sort of solution. Also, you should have sensible settings so that you balance the user safety with user experience. The most secure experience is probably the least enjoyable for the user. So you don't capture anything about it, and everybody gets the same stuff. There's no personalization, probably not all that enjoyable. But at the same time, that's the most safe for the user. Defense in depth, you should always do that. And that's part of what I was kind of alluding to with this de-identify. Yeah, sure, you should definitely de-identify your data, but you shouldn't assume that that is sufficient. You want to have other controls in place at each one of the layers where data is being interacted with, so that if for some reason somebody gets through one of the gates, that uh, they're not through all of them. So you want to have various layers of approaches to your security that differ in different ways. And with that, I'll wrap this up. We've reached kind of the end of the material I've created for today. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Let me know what's going on. If you need assistance, that's what I'm here for. If I don't hear from you between here and then, I'll talk to you next week. Stay safe and good luck with your assignments.